Hello, very beautiful community. Let's talk about the wildfires in LA. It's a cruel truth, but a truth that events of this type are predictable. It's not a truth that they are the new normal, because the new normal is much worse than what we're seeing, and that it'll escalate over the decades to come through till the end of the century. And fortunately, the death toll is relatively low, but the pictures are shocking in the sense that they are war-like, perhaps sort of stuff that's the closest that Americans on American soil can get to an experience of war. The climate crisis will be the closest Americans get to the experience of war in the years to come on home turf. And immediately our mind jumps to the informational environment. So let's say a few words about that. Now, first, prophylactically, if you are impacted, you know people who are impacted, or you're just interested, you're following the story, don't get into debates with people and make points to them which they can't see. Don't try to persuade climate science deniers of climate science. We have a lovely colleague here on YouTube, James Hoffman, who likes to say, and he's in the coffee niche, that he's the best person on this platform in the coffee niche. And he likes to say that, you can't complain that your cup of coffee isn't great in a cafe that's not capable of making a great cup of coffee. So don't ask for something in a place you can't get it. Of course, it's a general truth that these days, when bad things happen, our discourse about them being untethered from truthfulness can be almost as damaging as the event itself, partly because it makes us worse at handling future versions of the same event. And there is also a problem we have around, keeping two things in mind. And in this case, you want to say climate change, but you also want to say other factors are involved, which we can discuss, right? And these two things are not mutually exclusive. And at the same time, even putting aside the purposeful weaponization of this online, that's sort of legion, it's still true that a lot of people sincerely struggle to keep two things in mind, right? You can say, well, we've got a real problem with the interaction of housing policy and the climate crisis, right? There's lots of things we can do differently. But people are struggling. You've got to either say climate change full stop, there's nothing anyone can do, or you've got to say there's lots of things that we've done wrong and we don't talk about the climate crisis. It's a ridiculous dichotomy that you're seeing online that is easy to transcend really for any 6-year-old. But in some ways, we are worse than 6-year-olds when we are conditioned by algorithms. And of course, when we link events to climate change, there are two ways to do so. It's very important there are two, not one. The first is something that we're increasingly good at, and that's linking a particular event to climate change. We can't always do that, but we're getting better at it. That's one way to make a link. But there is another way to make a link that a lot of people resist, and I dismiss that resistance. And that's resistance that says, unless you can absolutely prove that in a particular case that something is an expression of a climate crisis, you can't connect the two. And I say, no, that's not going to happen in a serious conversation, right? If I get robbed on the most dangerous street in town, right, I'm going to be theoretically open to the possibility that there is no connection between me being on a dangerous street in town, me getting robbed. And it could be true that there isn't a connection. It could be that I got robbed by Ricky, who normally tries to rob people on a safer street in town, has just traveled over to the most dangerous one. But the fact that that occurs on that street is still a fundamental illustration of the sorts of things, of the social reality on that street. You can say that's what life on that street looks like, even though in this particular case, the background causation is atypical, right? So it's not necessary to provide a sort of a particular linkage in each case to make the connection, right? The fact that a particular event is 50 times more probable is enough, right? Short of making the particular connection. But I think as a philosopher, one important thing that this event raises is how far can a city lose a neighborhood and go on as though nothing had ever happened? That's a sort of exaggerated question, but it's a question at the heart of our experience of the climate crisis. And the answer is shocking. Right? We've talked in a different connection about how far it's possible for us to abstract away a small percentage of the population that got knocked out by post-viral illness with the pandemic, right? So we're talking about 1 in 200 people potentially. So that's a lot, right? It's hundreds of thousands in the UK, and that's a modest number. And we still have debates as to whether that's even true and whether these people really have been knocked out, even though the government says, well, hundreds of thousands are outside of the economy. And that's, what would have happened to me had I not had a me when I got COVID. But while I was already sick and only working 2 or 3 hours from home now a day, I'm now working 1 hour from home because of the heart damage and the microvascular damage I sustained in August. And people are still debating whether this is real and it happens. And so the question is, how many people could be knocked out of society and the economy like that before we notice? Obviously, if it's 30%, we notice. But if it's 0.5%, if it's 1%, we don't much. If it's 2%, we don't much. Now back to the climate crisis. Our capacity to, disregard, people even in our country having shocking impacts and just go on as normal is going to be very, very disconcerting, right? There's so much that humans can, normalize, right? A bunch of, demons are gobbling up, people in the neighboring street, but your street is fine, so we can kind of go on as though it were normal. Right? We often talk about this in connection to what the Russian population is doing with Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And this, of course, raises an important question about ecofascism. Now, the bridge between the current reaction to the LA fires and ecofascism is that there is going to be a group of people who don't like talking about the climate crisis much, but they do want to talk a lot about mitigation, and then they begin to talk about mitigation in an exclusionary way, and then you have the first seeds of what we haven't got yet, but we will have in the 2030s, and that is hard right pro-climate politics. Now, I've promised a separate episode on this, health allowing at some point it'll appear, but of course our capacity to deal with a lot of people being knocked out by particular events and go on as normal will then reach a second layer. And that will be not just about saying, it's okay, we can ignore if it's just a small percentage of us. It'll move on to a second layer, which says then there are particular humans for whom it's okay to have these impacts, and then particular other humans. And here you can expect an emphasis of whiteness in the 2030s, unfortunately. You can expect not hyper-identity politics, but identity politics, pro-white identity politics, the evil of pro-white identity politics. You can expect that tied to how we think of which groups are excluded and which groups are included, and how we try to protect ourselves from the climate crisis. Enough. There's a lot more to say, but enough. Lots of love.